If science can't detect God, does that mean God is real? That's what Karlo Broussard wants you to think. So let's look at why he's wrong and why rational people simply do not operate as the religious do. We return to Catholic apologist Karlo Broussard as he tries to make excuses for why science can't detect God and why the faithful should keep believing anyhow. But as is no surprise, he just manages to prove why belief in the supernatural is so downright silly in the first place, and why no one ought to take any of these unsupported and unprovable claims seriously. Does it matter that science can't detect God? Not to the delusional, but who would want to be delusional anyhow?
Atheists often justify their atheism by saying there's no evidence for God.
Which is true. It's the same justification I use for everything that cannot be rationally demonstrated that I therefore reject acceptance of, and that includes leprechauns and unicorns and honest politicians. These things are going to be considered mythical right up until someone can present objectively derived evidence for them. And the religious know they have none, so, as Karlo here is doing, they make excuses. But these excuses are uniformly unimpressive.
But when pressed about what type of evidence they're looking for, it often turns out they're only looking for scientific evidence.
I'm looking for objectively verifiable evidence. Evidence that anyone can freely examine without having to believe anything about it first. If I have to believe in your book, if I have to believe in your claims, if I have to have faith that you're right before I can be convinced that your God is real, then what you're pushing isn't a real thing, it's a concept. And concepts can't do anything by themselves.
But this quest for truth starts off on the wrong foot.
According to you. But that's only because you have a pre-existing emotional attachment to an idea that can't be rationally justified. You believe in something that can't be independently examined or intellectually discovered, and because you have this emotional attachment, it skews your entire thought process toward this ridiculous idea that you have no way to justify.
Science is an empirically based discipline, and as such is ordered to physical reality within our physical universe.
Because that's all we have any reason to think is real. It's the only system we currently have that produces objectively demonstrable results that are independently testable and produces verifiable predictions about reality. Now, if you have another system that can be tested and proven to be just as accurate, let us know. I predict silence at this point.
But if science is detecting powers or restricted to physical reality, and God, by definition, is a non-physical being, well then, how could science in principle detect God?
Here's where he goes completely off the rails. See, God is not a non-physical being by definition. God is a non-physical being by assertion. Because there's no way to study a real God, any God, and find out what its actual characteristics are. Therefore, the characteristics arbitrarily assigned to God are just made up. They have to be. There's no way that they couldn't be. If you start from a completely neutral position with no beliefs about this God thing, then coming up with any objective conclusions about what this God is utterly impossible. It doesn't matter if you're trying to do it today, or if you're taking the word of people who lived 1,000 years ago. It simply cannot be done without blind and utterly empty faith. So saying God is beyond detection is meaningless. It's the same thing as saying God doesn't exist.
The answer is, it can't. Science can no more detect God than a metal detector can detect plastic cups.
But plastic cups can be objectively detected in other ways. God cannot. God, by the definition that the religious have stapled onto him, cannot be detected in any rational, objectively demonstrable way, period. Now, my go-to counterexample are invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. I know you've heard me talk about them before. All of those characteristics I just made up and arbitrarily assigned to these creatures because there's no conceivable way, even if I was convinced that the pixies were real, which of course I'm not, but even if I were, I cannot rationally discover anything about them, specifically because of how they're defined. It's really why God is the way he is, because the religious were terrified that when people couldn't objectively find him, they'd reject belief. So they just pretended that it's part of the game and nobody is supposed to be able to discover anything about God. But you know, for a God that is completely undetectable, the religious will tell you everything about him, what he wants, what he's like, and everything he's going to do to you if you don't kiss his ass. That doesn't sound kosher, does it? Yes, it is every bit as stupid as it sounds.
And to not believe in God because there is no scientific evidence for him is as unreasonable as refusing to believe there are plastic cups on the beach because the metal detector provided no evidence for them.
But the inability of anything to detect them absolutely would. At the very least, it would suggest that there's no reason to take the claimed existence of these objectively unverifiable plastic cups seriously. Again, it is rationally unreasonable to accept the existence of anything for which objectively verifiable evidence cannot be provided. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it certainly gives no reason to think that it does.
The metal detector's inability to detect plastic cups says nothing whether or not plastic cups exist on the beach. It's simply a manifestation of the limitations of the detecting powers of the instrument.
No, it's a limitation of the detecting powers of any instrument. Any instrument at all. Because according to the religious, their gods are absolutely, completely, and totally undetectable via any objective means whatsoever. And if that's the case, how did the religious come to the conclusion that this God thing was real or had those characteristics in the first place? Because rational positions must be testable, and they have arbitrarily defined their deity to be untestable in any way.
Similarly, science's inability to detect God says nothing about whether or not God exists.
It just says everything about the unreasonableness of believing that God exists. I can't prove that Bigfoot isn't real, but the lack of any corroboratory evidence for the existence of Bigfoot means I will not believe that he does until said evidence shows up. God doesn't get a pass because believing in him makes you feel good.
It's simply a manifestation of the limitations of the detecting powers of science. It can be used to detect only that which is empirically verifiable and quantifiably measurable.
Now, name anything that is demonstrably real that doesn't fall into either of those categories. Go ahead. We'll wait.
To say that God doesn't exist because science can't detect him is to confuse the method for knowing reality with reality itself.
That's a complete misrepresentation of the position of pretty much every atheist I have ever encountered, which I guess shouldn't surprise anyone. I'm not saying that God doesn't exist because he can't be detected. I'm saying that I'm not going to believe he exists until he can be detected. The burden of proof is on the people making the claim, which is the religious, never on the people who reject that claim for lack of evidence. And I think Karlo knows that, which is why he's throwing out a straw man, which might impress his gullible religious followers, but it doesn't do a thing for the rational and intellectual.
In order to know the things that science can't, such as God, we must use other methods, such as philosophy.
Which is not a reliable means for determining anything about reality, because any argument that you can make for the existence of God I can use to prove the existence of invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. So I'll just find and replace. It also works for super powerful aliens, magical unicorns, any god ever invented. The list goes on and on and on. Philosophy doesn't actually prove anything. You can't point to a table and tell philosophy to prove its existence. It doesn't work that way.
So, it really doesn't matter that science can't detect God, and therefore it's not a justifiable reason to be an atheist.
Of course it is. Skepticism demands that we don't believe things for which we have no good reason to think are real. I'm also an alien abductionist for the same reason. It also makes me an Loch Ness monsterist. And while I suspect Karlo is as well, I don't think he intellectually understands why he rejects some things for lack of evidence, yet buys into his imaginary friend even though there's the exact same lack of evidence.
If you want to learn more about this topic and others like it, visit our website at Catholic.com. For Catholic Answers, I'm Karlo Broussard. Thanks for watching.
It really isn't a surprise that people like Karlo, in fact, just about every theist, they don't understand what it is that they're doing wrong because, as I unfortunately have to keep saying, they are believing for emotional, not intellectual reasons. When it comes to their religious beliefs, their brains are firmly put in idle and they're not going anywhere. But honestly, it shouldn't be that hard for anyone to figure out the fatal flaws in Karlo's arguments if they are intellectually honest in the first place, which, unfortunately, for far too many religious people, they just aren't. They can't be. Even if you walk them through the steps and show them where they're wrong, they can't accept it because they are completely buried in their theological beliefs to the point that even considering the demonstrable facts throws them into religious disarray. That giant authoritarian religious hand clamps down on their brain and says, nope, you can't think about that at all, because nothing I'm saying is unreasonable, if you're reasonable to begin with, and none of it is at all untrue. The religious have ideas which cannot be tested, beliefs which cannot be validated, and rely solely on emotion and wishful thinking to remain even remotely viable in the mind of the believer. It's why debating the fanatically religious is so pointless most of the time, because in the brain of every believer is a little tiny Gandalf yelling, "You shall not pass!" when you get to a certain point, and it triggers the religious panic button. It shuts everything down. Nope, can't do it. Nope, 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 nope. And getting past that is difficult, if not impossible, until the theist is ready to admit that reality and their beliefs have little, if anything, to do with each other. So, like little children, the rational among us have to keep the religious from hurting themselves and others, at least as much as we can, and we have to wait for them to grow up. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Hopefully, as time goes on, it will happen more often than not. Because, really, having to spend my time explaining the obvious to the delusional, it's getting pretty old.